Firstly, I'd like to say I'm David, and also to say quite early on that I recognise that some people listening in on this tonight, or perhaps on a video recording sometime in the weeks to come, may not be Christians, may not be Methodists, and may not really understand what we're talking about, other than they've heard this funny word called chaplaincy. So if I say anything that isn't terribly clear, do put a comment in chat, or I've already put my contacts in chat, and my colleague Paul Chesterman is on the call tonight, and I can see some other people that know me quite well, like Carol Wilson and others that will know where you can find me, and Gary will know where you can find me. So that's good. So I'm David Butterworth. I'm a presbyter. I do not have pastoral charge in the Birmingham district. I came out to the London district, where my church could some Sundays be 500 Caribbean, Ghanaian, Nigerian wonderful people in North London. And I was invited by the chair of the Birmingham district to come and have a look at Birmingham and potentially be chaplain for the National Exhibition Centre, which comprises the NEC and the International Conference Centre and the big arenas in the wider Birmingham region and in other places. And to be truthful, it looked exciting, but it looked too narrow. And so without uttering a word, in my head, I was thinking, it's too narrow, it's too narrow, it's too narrow. And Bill Anderson, thank God, said, spirit-led, and he had not heard my question because I hadn't articulated it. He said, David, think of the wider picture, which was like a voice from heaven speaking into that void. And I'd been a chaplain in the lay volunteer chaplain in the police service in Warwickshire for some years. And I knew some other chaplains as well. And in the London district, I'd worked with chaplains. And I knew, frankly, there were a lot of broken chaplains on the edge of church, is how they felt. And so it was that wider picture that actually started me to think, yes, perhaps I'm the right person to be doing this. So I came into the district without a brief. There was no job description. There was hardly a person spec. And the guidance I had was that view from Bill, think of the wider picture, David. And I'm blissfully happy in chaplaincy at the NEC, but there is a much, much wider picture. Chaplaincy is part of my responsibility, but I've also spoken in the House of Lords about refugees and community sponsorship, challenged authorities locally and nationally about the real living wage with Citizens UK, and we brought 550 refugees into Birmingham when hardly any other city or space was doing that. But tonight, I just wish to share about chaplaincy, please. I certainly dreamt that chaplaincy would be a community of good practice. I found a very mixed economy, to be perfectly truthful, and I'm sure some of you on this screen tonight will understand where I'm going with this. I found that some chaplains were paid for 3 hours a week to do 12 hours a week chaplaincy. Some chaplains were not paid at all. Some were full-time and paid reasonably well. Some were volunteers. Some were trapped in silo mentality and silo circumstances. Some had no training at all, and some had no support at all. And I'm a person that believes in collaboration. So I try to extend, as Wesley says, extend that hand of friendship to those people that were hurting, but deliberately in the beginning, to try and discern those people that were hurting the most. And after listening to a number of chaplains that were hurting, I rang my friend who was in the Connexional office at the time, Tony Tidy, and recommended, could we do a Connexional Wellbeing Day for chaplains? And he said, frankly, David, we've never done one. The Connection has never done that, never seen a need for it. But together, that word collaborative again, together collaborative, perhaps we can do something. And so we put the first Wellbeing Day together for chaplains in the whole of the Connection, in the whole of our history. Surprisingly, surprised me that 45 chaplains came to that from all over the country. We then, through learning in that environment, we then said to the Birmingham District Synod and tried to encourage other synods that perhaps we should have a synod day in synod business, and the morning and perhaps just after lunch could be about chaplains. And I invited chaplains from different contexts, and that silo environment and thinking was stronger than I first thought it was, because some people had been almost trapped or fastened in healthcare chaplaincy, prison chaplaincy, retail chaplaincy, schools chaplaincy, but rarely, well, never in my first conversation, never was there a melting pot where everybody could actually come together and really see the value of each other's chaplaincy. And I said quite simply, naively perhaps in the beginning, well, you may be a healthcare chaplain, but I meet the lady that's in the hospital bed when she's coming shopping or coming to an event at the NEC. Educational chaplains meet them when they go and see their grandchildren in universities. So we are already connectional, but we're not working connectionally in that way. People at Synod were in tears when they heard the cameo stories from MHA and the mental health well-being chaplains and other people. And they said, a bit like Gary said earlier, why on earth did we never know this? Why did we not know that this ministry called chaplaincy was alive and kicking and doing so many amazing things? And people came back into Synod after the breakout rooms and they were tearful. And so we made a commitment to step closer to each other. That was us being the chaplains. We stood and physically said, we will take a step closer to church communities. And we asked Synod, the body of Synod, 200 people, to physically stand up if they could and take a step closer to us and try and work more together in a dovetail environment. The next year we had another gathering, 95 people came at Solihull Methodist Church from all over the country again. And then just recently, a few weeks ago, we had a Zoom webinar for wellbeing chaplains, practitioners, and 175 people registered for that. If you'd like to see the recordings, they're on the Connexional website with our media team and Mike Ivert. So in my chaplaincy, I discovered that people were not in places of good practice. And one of my roles seemed to manifest to be that animator or that person that will articulate that there is a need for good practice and good safeguarding and good pastoral care and good inclusion in decision making around the ministry called chaplaincy. I'm fortunate at the National Exhibition Centre because they're a place that really lives and breathes people skills and good practice. I sit within the wellbeing team of 25 HR consultants, and they're all postgraduate, well trained in HR skills, and they love their people to bits. But I did find that in some places, chaplains that didn't have good relationships with their hosts, whether that was a car manufacturer or an airport or a hospital or a school or a university, they would say, or very negatively, come back the days of the welfare officer. And they were saying that because perhaps that's when they remembered chaplaincy being in a good place for them. But because they've not maintained a good relationship with the HR team and the well-being world as it translated itself into the 20th century and more recently in the last few years, perhaps they'd felt edged to the side. And so I always stand up for good practice, and church hasn't got it right in many, many places. And to go back to something that Gary said, and I've discussed this with Gary recently, the Methodist Church has not got it right with chaplaincy in the past. It's funded my role, thank God, but actually there's not been that well-being, there's not been that pathway of conversation, and people have come in and popped out again. And so what we've tried to do in the Birmingham district in particular, and that's been echoed by people coming from other circuits and districts, mindful that not everybody will be coming from a Methodist background or parishes and other places, that the articulation of good practice, good care, good training is paramount for the longevity of chaplaincy and the safeguarding of chaplains and the people that chaplains meet in many different places and settings. I would like to encourage people, I'm not saying that you're not doing any of these things now, of course, but to really get rid of those terms, loitering with intent. That's such an outdated comment that I resist that. And I would encourage people to think of strategic presence, that you start to, we start to understand where we are needed and where we are needed the most to make our presence felt the most appropriately, so that we know and we engage with our HR partners and our well-being managers and our well-being teams and our mental health ambassadors, rather than grumbling and complaining, as I do hear some chaplains grumbling and complaining. HR are not bothered in chaplaincy. Well-being isn't interested in chaplaincy. Well, actually, they won't be if they don't know you and you've not got that authentic voice in their business or their setting to be able to hear that what you say resonates of truth, because you've encountered many of their members of staff or business partners or visitors to their premises. So the authentic story of a chaplain needs to be current and live. And I'm blessed that I'm invited as often as I can possibly go to HR meetings with 25 HR business partners for a significant business. I'm also invited to tables with managing directors. I'm also fortunate that I have a foot in chaplaincy in universities in the West Midlands, and with our partners of the United Reformed Church and others, the Anglican community, I'm the chair of Free Church Chaplaincy for the University of Warwick and also Coventry University. And again, it's that good practice that drips from my fingertips, hopefully, when I meet HR directors and well-being directors, so that they know that I really look for good practice, I articulate good practice, and I speak inclusive words. And I mean from my heart to include everyone and exclude no one. I'm still aware that some of our chaplaincy folks still are not inclusive in their thinking. They're not inclusive in their theology. And I think any HR well-being manager will be looking for that. And it will ring as an alarm bell if they're not hearing inclusive language and inclusive practice in that first introductory conversation with whoever you might be speaking to. So I would encourage people, if you're from a circuit, speak to your circuit staff team and let them know what you're doing. Challenge your circuit staff team or your parish staff team to be able to speak at your missions meetings, to actually have inclusion in Sunday worship. Even now in Zoom, it's potentially easier in Zoom rather than traveling everywhere. But it's our responsibility as chaplains, if we feel that we've been called and we've climbed in that boat that Clive articulated earlier, and we've hung on to the uncertainties of our early days in chaplaincy, and we can feel some calmness in the storm developing, then why would we not speak about the beautiful ministry of chaplaincy and speak it to our people that send us? Certainly as a presbyter, I'm sent by the Methodist Church. My stipend's paid by the Methodist Church. So why would I not want to be able to do my best to say, well, this is what we do? And so it's been a real privilege over the last few years to articulate that on Radio 4 and Press and Methodist Recorder and other local publications. I work well collaboratively, as well as I can be, to listen to other people and other practitioners of chaplaincy. And so in our recent chaplaincy webinar, it was natural for me to invite one of the lead Jewish prison chaplains to speak, a lovely guy called Keith. And it was natural again to invite the first woman Muslim chaplain from Durham University. And actually in the world of chaplaincy, we speak beautifully and harmoniously. We're not in those environments where people are challenging each other's faith perspective that much. I mean, clearly there are some areas where we do need to tease open our different values and our different theological perspectives, but actually our hosts need to see us working beautifully together. Otherwise they'll say, you know, what's the worth? I really want to encourage people to look at social media and engage with social media. We now live in such a fast-moving world where people are very disparate, and without Zoom and without WhatsApp and without Twitter and without Instagram, we would find it awfully hard to communicate with our hosts, with their employees, with their team networks, and we get so left behind. And perhaps that's where Gary was indicating earlier when he said that some of our church communities are terrified that our numbers are falling and churches are closing But actually in the world of chaplaincy, the level of interest is increasing. And but perhaps as chaplains, we're not the ambassadors we might be by saying, well, look at this case study. In fact, sometimes when I speak about developing case studies for different scenarios, some chaplains and some collaborative chaplaincy groups have said, what's a case study? Because they're not aware of some of the terminology that some of others are. So our connectional collaborative nature should help us all articulate good practice in various sessions. I'd like to give you an example. Tell me when to stop speaking, Gary, please, because I can speak forever. A good example, at the NEC at Remembrance Sunday and November the 11th, normally we're surrounded by 100,000 people coming to Christmas events and pre-Christmas events, and we stop for 2 minutes, and 100,000 people stop, and I'm very evident lining up with members of staff that used to be in the services, men and women, and members of the public stop and they come and stand with us. Well, this year it was totally different. So through good practice, through good relationships, through knowing who the HR and the wellbeing directors and managers are, I suggested gently and collaboratively that perhaps we did something differently for Remembrance Sunday this year. And knowing that many members of staff had been hit by COVID in their families, and several of them had encountered deaths from mums and dads, and naturally, like many other people, couldn't go to the funeral and had to stay distant. So a lot of hurting people. And so cutting a long story short, there's a lakeside at the NEC and an old millstone from an old working environment. And I recommended gently that perhaps we could use that as a marker point, like a headstone, like a cenotaph. And so quietly on November the 11th, me and 11 other people stood distanced by the lakeside, and we used the old millstone as a cenotaph, and we placed a wreath and held 2 minutes silence. That came out of the blue, really. COVID's hit us very strangely, and so it's made us to think of other spaces and places, how to communicate who we are and where we are. And the NEC took it upon themselves with agreement to video that event and put it on their national media platform, on their national internet platforms, but also on their intranet platforms, which goes to over 2,000 partners inside the business, so that members of staff that are now distanced or furloughed or have already started to be made redundant, sadly, they could see that we were mindful of their loved ones. And we actually made a moment in time to remember to articulate the names in the written form of families that had died through COVID connected with the NEC, and also to remember the names of the senior decision makers in the NEC, because our leaders are in a very precarious position. So that was very, very useful. One of the people that's with us this evening, I can see her name but not her picture, is Carol Wilson, who is a Methodist local preacher in the Birmingham district. Carol has the position of the lead of spirituality for Birmingham Solihull Mental Health Trust Foundation, and she operates over 85 sites in the Birmingham, West Midlands, Solihull region. Carol was one of our key speakers at our recent webinar, and she sat in juxtaposition with the Director of Public Health, who we'd also invited. And because of our collaborative nature, we now have access to key opinion forms in the wider West Midlands. And so Justine Varney, the Director of Public Health, came and spoke for the first 20 minutes or so, and was remarked on what an extensive group of chaplains we were registering for this event, 175 from all over the United Kingdom. But Carol hit the nail on the head from her authentic position, being a practitioner in well-being. And she used a term, which I'm going to repeat now, and I perhaps spend 1 or 2 minutes for us to think about this. She used the term moral injury. It may not mean anything to you at this moment in time, but as I say those words, I'm going goosebumpy on my arms and shoulders. Chaplains are people, generally, that love people. We want to be with people. It's not about our story when we're with people. It's about listening to the others that we encounter. And when they stop talking, we listen even more. And indeed, a bit like those stories that we heard earlier from Clive, many people have said to me in the past, and I know the chaplains experience this, that when people are listened to by a chaplain, the person that's being listened to will actually, at the end of the conversation, say, I've never been listened before so well and so intently. And actually, it's the silence that God uses, I believe, to actually resonate that we are people as ambassadors of God in that listening context. Carol articulated this phrase called moral injury, that we're like nurses and doctors and surgeons, places that are controlling car parks, lovely security people. Whereas now we're having to say, no, you cannot come. No, you cannot hug your family. No, you cannot go into your workplace. And no, we can't spend time together. And actually, over a protracted period of time, that damages our own mental well-being and our own abilities to actually stay resilient in this unknown field of care. And so often we think we're there to offer love and compassion to others. Clearly, that's what a chaplain does do most of the time. But where is the compassion and the self-care for ourselves? Likewise, where is the compassion and care for the head of a business or the chief executive of a foundation hospital trust or the prison warden, senior prison warden? Where is the healthcare and well-being for them? Because we're all in that same boat that we heard talked about by Clive. We're all in those choppy seas of not knowing which way to go or even who to speak to. So I really applaud what the Connection is doing at this moment in time by encouraging chaplains to speak together. But I will continue, please, and I would encourage other people to encourage and challenge the Methodist Church and our partners, both on an ecumenical basis and an interfaith basis, to actually speak up more, to stand up more, and to be more overt. On a community program a little while ago with Birmingham Mental Health Foundation Community Trust, they've got a wonderful community radio program, and I've been invited to that a few times. And me and some other people from an interfaith perspective are doing some more stuff over Christmas and the early part of the new year. But a key question from the Mental Health Trust is that if somebody wanted to be in touch with you as a chaplain, how would they do that? So how would they know where all of us are? How do our prisoners and our nurses and our doctors know where we are? How do our school teachers and university lecturers and students know where we are? Unless we say we are here and make it overtly known that we are here through social media and other ways, they won't know and they will flounder, and we will be the sorrier for it. At our Warwick University and Coventry University chaplaincies, the chaplains in those contexts are using multimedia beautifully. The presbyters and the volunteers are developing online services for Remembrance Sunday or for the first and second Sundays of Advent. And I've taken it upon myself as the chair of that group to circulate that to local churches for example, in the Coventry area, the Nuneaton area, the Leamington Spa and Warwick areas. But again, chaplains need to be that stirrer of the pot, because our circuits and our churches are not in those spheres of social media, so they will not know what is happening in chaplaincy. So we've got to be multifaceted and multi-pronged, as it were, to be able to nudge the people that we think we need to know, because if we don't do it, frankly, nobody else will do it. We've got a wonderful story to tell as chaplains, and I really would encourage chaplains to tell that story. When we closed our session with the 175 people registering, we We downloaded the video, we cut it into sections, and we've sent it out to hundreds of people, and well over 300 people have downloaded the video in its whole or in the parts. So there is an absolute need for us to feed and look after each other with good practice and well-being and good training. But also there's a need for us to communicate that to the people that we seek to serve. The story of the boat crossing the lake, to me, is a very powerful one, because I heard it through an Ignatian's spiritual retreat years ago, but I wasn't in the boat. I was one of the people running around the edges of the lake to be there when Jesus got to the other side. And it was through that my sense of call came to be on the other side. And perhaps that was leading me to be outside the church walls 24/7 and not in the boat, but to be a privileged member of the people that were in the boat, and to be an ambassador for the people in the boat. And perhaps tonight is linking those stories together so that we are being sent by our church and faith communities. I'm mindful that some of the people listening tonight might be from a Buddhist chaplaincy background, or a Muslim Islamic tradition background, or a Jewish tradition background. And so if we're using Bible stories to indicate what we think, it challenges us sometimes to see what other areas that you might bring to that conversation. And perhaps we could use scriptural reasoning from the Rose Castle Foundation to actually articulate and unpack some of our theological thinking, so that we go like this with our faith stories, rather than appearing to go like that, which is what the popular world thinks we do sometimes. I'm mindful tonight's about people speaking with each other, so unless Gary and James, you want me to continue speaking, I'm going to be quiet and let us go into our breakout rooms and share together more intimately than this.